this afternoon on elms and hairstreaks, two very important connected species. Now, you may remember that last year we did a very successful initiative to help the brimstone butterfly across our area, and we, together with Paul Selby, we organised a special selling of buckthorns, which many of you contributed towards and planted in gardens, and we got them across the local area for the brimstone butterfly. And that was such a success, we thought, we got our heads together and decided to try and repeat the success of that with another species. And the one we've chosen is this beautiful white-letter hairstreak butterfly and elm. So we'll have a bit about questions at the end. So if you have any questions that you're burning to ask, you can type them in during the talk and then we'll go to them at the end. But for the moment, I'd like to hand you straight over to Paul Selby.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us today. You're very welcome. As Ben said, there'll be a chance for questions at the end, but feel free to put some in the text in the sidebar, and we'll pick those up at the end as well. So what's this about? This is about the Elms and Hairstreaks Initiative, and the contents today. I'm going to talk a bit about who I am, elm tree species, identification of facts, Dutch Elm Disease, a bit about the Chelsea Road elm tree, other Sheffield elm trees, the future of elm trees in general, some lessons from everything to do with Dutch Elm Disease for the future, a bit about the white-letter hairstreak butterfly and other elm-dependent species, specifically about the Elms and Hairstreaks Initiative that we're working together on collectively, and some questions at the end. So that's what we're going to go through in the next 55 minutes. So background, who I am. Age 40, I work as a civil servant for the Department for Work and Pensions in my day job, and I'm a professionally qualified economist and senior government analyst. However, that's what I do in my day job. In my spare time, I've got a very keen interest in nature and wildlife, birds, butterflies, plants and trees, heavily involved in the Sheffield Street Tree campaign, and worked initially, this is how I made my contacts with the Wildlife Trust, worked initially with the Wildlife Trust to save the Chelsea Road elm tree, more of which later. And I've continued to lead efforts to increase elms in Sheffield for the benefit of the white-letter hairstreak butterfly. And I also continue to work with the Wildlife Trust in other ways, as Ben's already mentioned, with last year's buckthorn for brimstones initiative that was so successful and was based upon an initiative down in East Suffolk that was also incredibly successful at increasing the brimstone butterfly population. So specifically onto elm species in particular. Now, some people, will not know much about elms because they've disappeared from much of the countryside. Okay, yes, some small elms still do survive in hedgerows. They're actually relatively common in hedgerows, but because they're often clipped to within an inch of their life in hedgerows, and when they do get allowed to grow anything above sort of 2.5, 3 meters, they tend to die. You might not be particularly familiar, and it's sometimes easy to get confused between elms and hornbeams and hazels as well. So here's a bit of a quick ID guide in terms of understanding what the elms are. Now, I'm ignoring the resistant elms here for a second. I'm only focusing on sort of what I would class as the native elms: English elm, field elm, wych elm, Huntingdon elm, and European white elm. And the key thing on the bottom left is to focus on these two key features, regardless of the specific elm. And it's the double-toothed leaf edge that is really noticeable, which obviously in trees like oak, it's completely different shape, or beech, they're pretty smooth-sided, sort of oval-shaped. Elms have got these double-toothed leaf edges. And the other key feature, which is not on similar-ish hazel, is the basal lobe is asymmetric at the base. So I don't know if you can see in detail there, but basically this side finishes sort of there, and lower down the other side of the leaf joins the stem. And that is unique to elms. No other species have got that. So that's how you identify elms in general. And then specifically, and there'll be more detail later on in the next few slides, the difference between wych elm, smooth-leaved elm, and English elm. Well, firstly, wych elm leaves are much, much bigger and sort of oval shaped in general than the English elm or the smooth-leaved elm. So they're much more oval and much bigger. And, you know, they can be quite massive, actually, especially the lower down leaves. They can be pretty huge. So look out for those. And it talks about the specific size. And then you've got these two that are quite similar. And actually, the reason for why they're quite similar is because English elm is a variant of the smooth-leaved elm, the almost minor or field elm that is sometimes known as. And these tend to be more circular shaped generally. Both of them are more circular shaped. Yes, okay, they're still ever so slightly oval, but they're slightly more circular than a wych elm. And also they're smaller generally. The leaves are much smaller generally, as you can sort of see in terms of what they talk about in terms of the size of the leaves in this table here. The difference between the smooth-leaved elm and the English elm is you tend to find that the leaves of the English elm are darker, as in a real deep dark green, compared to sort of a more yellowy green generally on field elms. And you'll see some more about this in the next slides. So English elm was probably the most common, or one of the most common UK trees up until the 60s. Had one of the, if you get up close, one of the most distinguishing features is this corky look to the stems of the sort of the youngish branches. You know, in some respects, if you didn't know better, it looks almost unhealthy, as if it's got some sort of disease. Not at all. That is just exactly what they used to look like, corky. And that's not a feature of the similar field elm. You can also see how dark the leaves are here, dark green. So that's another key feature. If you see them, if you were absolutely lucky to see a huge English elm in the distance in the past, there isn't any now, sadly, but if you were, this is what is known as sort of the classic figure of eight shape. I mean, it doesn't really look like a figure eight, but other people used to call it that because it actually quite often has this bulbous shape at the bottom, an inward bit here, and then it goes bulbous back out around the edges. And that's broadly what you'd see. And I'll show you a slide in a second that has a whole elm landscape of English elms that you'll be able to see. This other photo is of the two famous, they were quite famous, Preston Park twins. They were the oldest English elms in the whole world, about 400 years old each. Sadly, one of the two died in April 2020 of Dutch Elm Disease. So even in Brighton, which is a cordon sanitaire zone, sadly, Dutch Elm Disease is around and killed off one of the two. But one of them still survived. So if you're down in Brighton, happen to be anywhere near Preston Park, do visit the remaining twin. It is the oldest English elm in the world. And worth one saying, I said before about its Latin name for English elm is Ulmus procera, or Ulmus minor variation vulgaris. So it is a variant of field elm. And the other thing to say is they've got sterile seeds, so it can only be propagated by either taking cuttings or by its spreading sucker growth. So all English elms are clones of each other. And it's one of the reasons why Dutch Elm Disease was a disaster, because there was no genetic variation. So if one of the clones was susceptible to Dutch Elm Disease, all 100% were susceptible to Dutch Elm Disease. And that's one of the things we need to learn in terms of wider tree diseases. So that's English elms. And there's the slide. It's a picture, actually. It's a painted picture of an evocative elm landscape of the past. And that's what the English countryside used to look like all over England in particular, of lots of these trees with a relatively figure of eight shape that they'd got. Various different variants. Some were quite tall and thin, some were a bit wider like this one, but that's what it looked like. And from 1960s onwards, that landscape has completely disappeared. Not all of the hedgerows have been filled in with other trees. So, you know, and obviously hedgerows have disappeared as well because of other farming practices. But, you know, that landscape has been lost probably forever, sadly. Then we move on to field elm or smooth-leaved elm. As you can see here, look at the difference in the leaf colour. So the bottom is English elm with the corky growth and the darker leaves. And here's the field elm, which is a much sort of yellower green. And that is another feature. And also note no corkiness of the branch, the small branches. It's actually the predominant elm in East Anglia, where it is drier and similar to conditions in Europe, where the field elm is also the most common elm in Europe. Many variants of field elm, of which English elm is just one variant, the most common variant, but there are many variants. And there's someone called Brian Evesham, who's on Twitter, if any of you are, who has done his very best to classify the various subspecies of Ulmus minor in the UK, and I think it's close to 68, 70 different variations with ever so slightly different shaped leaves, sized leaves, shapes of the overall tree, characteristics of the bark, that sort of thing. So it is an imprecise science, I think, but broadly speaking, they're all one species, Ulmus minor. Some variants of Ulmus minor, field elm, do show resistance to Dutch elm disease, but they're not immune. For example, quite a few of these field elms, the old elms still exist in East Anglia and haven't died of Dutch elm disease, even though some of their neighbours have. And they've been attacked by the bark beetle, which causes Dutch elm disease, and they haven't died. However, when you take a cutting of that tree and try to grow it, when it is attacked at sort of an age of somewhere around 10, 15, 20 years old, when it's attacked by the bark beetle, whilst slightly resistant, it's not big enough to resist, and the young elms die. And so that is an interesting feature, is that some of the old elms that are Ulmus minor do survive, but they can't be propagated, which is really sad. Finally, wych elm. I say finally, I think there's one more as well. Wych elm, Ulmus glabra. That's much more common in northern UK. Probably the only truly native UK elm, because the other elms are suspected to have come from Europe with the Romans. So Ulmus glabra tends to be the only traditionally classed as native UK elm, and it can spread by seed and is the most common elm in western and northern UK, which I think says something about its preferred habitat conditions of slight wetness and that sort of thing. The wood is not favoured by the elm bark beetle, and so the bark beetle would prefer not to attack wych elms. And so therefore some have said, oh, well, wych elms are therefore resistant. Well, they're not. Actually, if there's only wych elms around, the bark beetle will go for the wych elms, and it actually can be attacked very, very quickly. The tree often succumbs very, very quickly. And I've seen that locally in Sheffield, when a wych elm is attacked, within 4 or 5 weeks, the whole tree is pretty much dead. So that is quite sad too. You can see the size of the leaf differences again here, a bit more detail on the size of the leaf differences. Look how big Ulmus glabra is, and there's the example compared to some of the other trees or Ulmus species. There's a picture of one relatively local wych elm. It's around the banks of the Lady Bar Reservoir, and that was taken a few years ago. So there is still a few wych elms left. The reason why this one has survived is because it's so isolated. You've got the massive gap between Sheffield and the Lady Bar, full of hardly any trees on the moors. And that's why that tree somehow survives isolated. But if the bark beetle was to ever get near it, it would die almost certainly. Finally, European white elm, and it's not a UK native species. You can see from this distribution map here where its native range is in Europe and not in the UK. There are a few examples in the UK, Ulmus laevis. So its trunk has two notable characteristics: a triangular shape. See there? See the triangular shape to the base of the trunk? So that's one feature of European white elm. And also the bottom trunk tends to be carpeted in leaf fur. Look at that. That's quite a unique characteristic of any tree, to be honest, not just of elms. From a distance, you might think, oh, it's got a climber growing up it. No, that's actually the leaves, leaf fur on the bark, lower base. And funnily enough, that photograph is taken on Knoll Lane in southwestern Sheffield. That's where one of the European white elms actually is. It's a street tree on Knoll Lane. So have a look at that if you ever go down Knoll Lane. It's close to Ecclesall Road South, so it's not that far up Knoll Lane from there. Look out for it. It's quite a unique tree, actually. Again, though, however, whilst the bark is less favoured by the elm bark beetle, if attacked, the tree is rarely resistant and certainly not immune to Dutch elm disease. Finally, on the species Huntingdon Elm, it's actually a hybrid between field elm and wych elm called Ulmus times hollandica vegeta. Sterile seeds again, big leaves, very similar to wych elm in terms of the leaf shape, grows very tall, much like the English elm. So you can see where it's got features of both its parents. And outside Brighton and Edinburgh, which are the two cordon sanus air zones for Dutch elm disease, if you see an elm over 50 years old, it's most likely to be a Huntingdon elm, because these really do have some resistance, not strong resistance, but some resistance, which is why of the old elms, they tend to be only Huntingdon elms. But again, the bark isn't favoured by the elm bark beetle, which is a feature of the wych elm, and it has some resistance too, which suggests it's got some of the resistance from whichever of the field elm variants was its parent. So that's quite interesting. And here's a picture of the Chelsea Road elm tree, more details in a second. So that's the Chelsea Road elm. And funnily enough, that tree, since I've been observing it in detail, 2016, so what are we, 7 years into observing it in detail, it has been attacked by the elm bark beetle and caught Dutch elm disease every single year and fought it off every single year. Wherever it's attacked, it tends to lose about a meter of canopy that dies off, but it can cut itself off. It can cut the infection off at about a meter and therefore doesn't die. But that's why the younger trees do die. So if a tree was just this height and it lost a meter of growth, that's enough to weaken it and kill it. And I saw a precise example of this because I took a cutting of the Chelsea Road elm tree in 2016 and planted it in my garden. And it got to 7 years old. And this summer it was attacked by the bark beetle and died. So it got to about 5 meters tall in just 7 years. But it wasn't, even at that height, it wasn't sufficient enough to fight off the Dutch elm disease, so died. And that is the same with all Huntingdon elms. So you might see the old ones in the countryside, but the young ones will not survive, I'm afraid. A bit more about Dutch elm disease now. So we talked quite a bit about it, but only at a high level. So it's a fungus spread by the elm bark beetle. Trees react to being infected by closing off their xylem, but not quickly enough for most trees, and therefore it kills off the whole tree. The first outbreak was in the 1920s as a relatively minor disease. However, a second outbreak of a more virulent strain began in 1964. We imported the bark beetle with this more virulent strain by a consignment of elm logs from the USA that arrived in Tetbury Docks, Gloucestershire. And as a result of that, 60 million elm trees is estimated, but there's various other estimates too, but it's estimated that around 60 million elm trees died in total from both waves. And it's still spreading. The 1964 wave reached Aberdeen only in the last few years, and it's still spreading through the Highlands of Scotland. It's slower progress in the cold north, but it is still spreading that wave. And after burning itself out in the mid-1980s, the latest wave hit Sheffield in 2012. But the process is less wave-like these days and has reached endemic proportions more quickly than expected. So what do I mean by this? We've got a bit of familiarity with epidemics, haven't we, from the last 3 years of COVID? So I'll talk about that in a second. But here's a picture of the elm bark beetle. This is how they tend to enter the bark. They burrow their way in. They've got the fungus on them. They enter the tree. Here, they infect the tree with the fungus, and the tree dies off both above because the xylem have cut itself off, have cut off the sort of like circulation of the tree, and below. And if the elm doesn't cut itself off sufficiently, it will infect the whole tree and die. Here's what was anticipated from waves of the disease. And, as I said, we've got a bit of experience of this from COVID. So There's your 30 million elms at the start. Dutch elm disease enters the country, there's an epidemic, it kills off all the trees, and then you'd hope that it sort of burns itself out. There's no more trees of the sufficient age to attack, so the elm bark beetle becomes less prominent, the young trees grow, maybe get back up to 50 million trees, and then there's another wave, and then there's another wave, and there's another wave, and eventually it flattens out, is the theory. Well, the actual reality of Dutch elm disease in the UK is there's been sort of a second wave, as I said, that hit. The first wave hit Sheffield in the 1980s, second wave hit Sheffield in about 2012, and actually now it's endemic. So I'd say that we're at the flat line point now. So there hasn't been 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 waves. Pretty much it's the second wave sufficient was to make it endemic, and that is the case in Sheffield, I'd suggest, at the moment. And here's just a bit of diagram, an estimate of roughly what happened in the UK. You can see all the elms concentrations in black. There was loads of elms in Wiltshire, for example. It was known as the Wiltshire weed, so that's where the greatest proportions of elms were. There were less elms in the high peaks and in some of the Dumfries and Galloway, and then it entered the country at Tetbury Docks, so lots of elms were killed, spread further, so there was no elms left at all, or dead elms only. And then a few years later, some of the young elms were starting to grow back from suckers or seedlings of wych elms, but obviously it's worked out that ultimately there's less elms in total in the country than there ever was before. Here's a few pictures of Dutch elm disease and how it attacks. So let's look at this one. You can see this tree was attacked on the left-hand side, and it may possibly 1 or 2 places from what I can see from that. No attacks on the right-hand side, but basically it's entered the base of the tree, and so it's not cut itself off sufficiently, and that whole right-hand side of the tree will also die in the next few months. That's probably about a month's worth of after infection. So that's how quick those sort of trees die. A bit closer up, it's a bit blurry here, but you can see it goes yellow first, then brown, and it happens very quickly. It's usually in around sort of late June, July, you see the impact of the infection every year of the trees. Here's a tree that is near me on Bank Road in Nether, Sheffield. It's not there anymore, but that level of dieback of yellowing and browning, basically there was no sign of it. I went on holiday in July 2016 and came back a week later, and that's the level of disease within a week on this young wych elm. That's how quick it can attack a tree. So really sad. If the disease is sufficiently protracted, the bark actually falls off or can be stripped off, and you can see the chambers of where the beetle has laid its eggs. So that's what it looks like underneath the bark. And there's an old picture of a hedgerow in black and white in the 1960s of an elm that's completely dead, another elm that's dying, another elm that looks like it's got an early sign of infection. And this was played out across the whole country. There's loads of pictures online if you just do a simple Google search of Dutch elm disease. Bit about the famous Chelsea Road elm tree. Now, Sheffield's probably most famous tree, I'd suggest. It's an 120-year-old Huntingdon Elm, one of less than 1,000 old elm trees in the whole of the UK outside the protected zones of Brighton and Edinburgh, home to a colony of the White-letter Hairstreak butterfly, a species that has declined from a stat that I saw back in 2016 by 97% in 30 years. Other estimates suggest it's more like 76% over 25 years or something like that. But regardless, it's declined significantly because it lays its eggs exclusively on elm trees, and without mature elm trees out there, the butterfly hasn't got any habitat to lay its eggs on, or much less habitat. So that's why the butterfly has declined in sympathy. The tree was pretty loosely, very little known, this famous tree now, but it wasn't back in pre-2016. But because Sheffield Council decided to fell it as part of its ill-fated street tree felling programme, and the fuss and publicity caused by myself and others, including the Wildlife Trust, we actually got it to win the English Tree come second place in the English Tree of the Year competition in 2016, and now it's one of the most famous elm trees in the country. As I said, it's caught Dutch elm disease every year since 2016 and fought it off every time. Interestingly, it did have a twin, this tree. Across the road, it had an equally sized tree on the other side of the road, on Chelsea Road. Sadly, when Virgin Media, or I think it was NTL then, was laying their cables in the 90s, they severed the root of that twin. And the next storm, it was rocking in the wind. And sadly, it had to be felled for safety reasons. But its twin had also survived the 1980s wave of Dutch elm disease, when all its compatriot elms also died in the local area. Other Sheffield elms, I've looked very closely in my part of Sheffield. So I live just here-ish, just here-ish there, and the Chelsea Road elm trees there. I've mapped various local elms nearby and sort of southwestern Sheffield. So we've got other Huntingdon elms. We've got one in Crosspool on Manchester Road, just as the houses end and you enter the first bits of the countryside. There's an old Huntingdon elm there. There's also Huntingdon elm on Hanover Way. If you ever drive down Hanover Way, there's one there. We've got, or had, English elms. We didn't have many English elms in Sheffield, but we had a few English elms in Bingham Park. This picture was taken in 2016. They died 1 year later, sadly, because they were infected with Dutch elm disease. The suckers still are there. They're near the allotments of Bingham Park. So if you can see the suckers of those English elms, but the old elms are now dead. I mentioned the Knoll Lane European White Elm. There's another picture of it from a different angle. We've also got some resistant elms that were planted in the 1980s. There's almost Sapporo Gold on Lyndhurst Road in Nether near the old hospital complex. And there's the odd wych elm in Brincliffe Edge Woods. 40-year-old elm is the oldest one I could find. There's a few slightly younger ones. This must have been a sapling when the original wave of Dutch elm disease came in 1980s. So it was too young to catch Dutch elm disease. But it's now 40 years old and susceptible because it's in a woodland. And you do find this with woodland elms. The elm bark beetle finds it harder to get to. Just one of those things in terms of features of the landscape. But it is susceptible to Dutch elm disease, and it's because it's on the border. Actually, I'm pretty sure it will catch it very soon. There's quite a few other elms that were here that were very young sapling elms, but all these elms have subsequently died since I first did this map in 2016. All these elms have died, including that one there, and a few others. Another one here, right close to the Chelsea Road elm, that also died as well. So yes, and there's another elm that was at the Beechief Crossroads. That elm also died, Dutch elm disease. So even in the 6-7 years since I first started noticing elms in the local community in detail, many of them have died off, which is another reason why we're doing the initiative, which we'll talk about shortly. What's the future of elm trees? Well, they do have a future, but probably never again as a true landscape tree. Brighton does have the National Elm Collection, and it had and maintained very successfully a cordon sanitaire zone, but they're having an absolute nightmare at the moment. All this fashion for log burners, well, loads of people are bringing in logs from the countryside infected with Dutch elm disease and bark beetles, leaving their wood outside, and then the elm bark beetle emerges in the spring in the middle of the city of Brighton and infects the mature elms. And they're having an absolute nightmare in Brighton as a result of that, which is really, really sad because they've done so well since the 1960s to protect Brighton's elms, and they're now really struggling because of the fashion for log burners, which is sad, very sad. Edinburgh also has a lot of elms still and has a bit of a cordon sanitaire zone. If you ever go to Edinburgh, notably on the hill slopes of Edinburgh Castle, there's lots and lots of wych elms. Also, 50 years of amateur and expert enthusiastic breeding have created a number of interesting cultivars that are, to a greater extent, Dutch elm disease resistant. Many are European elm species crossed with resistant Asian varieties. It's pretty certain that Dutch elm disease was imported to Europe and America from Asia, but the Asian elms were resistant to Dutch elm disease and cohabited the environment with Dutch elm disease for many years, and therefore were resistant. So crossing European elms with resistant Asian varieties has created naturally resistant cross partly European elms. Many of these were planted in the late 1980s onwards, but some of those have quite badly behaved, as they often have Siberian elm ancestry and have a bit of a habit of losing branches and snapping. They also don't have the prized number 8 shape that many of the sort of UK-based elm enthusiasts want, or because we had it in the English elm, they wanted that feature in new elms, which the resistant elms tend not to have. Interestingly, genetic modification is a possibility, but as is the thing with genetic modification, it's very controversial. Funnily enough, I think it was in the early 2000s, some scientists did create a Dutch Elm Disease resistant English elm via genetic modification, but it was at the time of Dolly the sheep, if people remember that, and the biggest controversy about genetic modification. And from what I hear, the scientists were abused significantly because of the GM techniques used on English elms, and so that project went quiet. Who knows whether those elms still exist somewhere in someone's back garden, but they quite possibly were all destroyed, sadly. So that's interesting. And there's a bit of an experiment going on, the Great British Elm Experiment. They've taken some of the what perceived to be resistant field elms in East Anglia and grown cuttings on and given those cuttings out for free to anyone who volunteered to have one and grow one. The hope is that some of them might be truly resistant even when they're young, but my belief and some of the other experts' belief is that they won't be. And just like my example of the Huntingdon Elm, they will catch Dutch elm disease at a young age and die, even if the older 100-year-old trees in East Anglia do survive. But we shall see. That's the whole point of an experiment. A bit more on the future of elms. Well, 5 highly resistant field elms were found in Spain and some in the UK too. 2 examples include Ulmus minor variant Adamus, which is the most promising, and also Ulmus minor variant Dehesa de Manuel. There's an example of the Dehesa de Manuel in Sheffield. I've got a copy of one. It's got an interesting habit when it's very young of growing sideways rather than upwards, but it does grow upwards eventually. But these Adamus is a bit more well behaved, and these are 100% resistant, but they're both from Spain originally. And there's a few, since Brexit, there's a few issues importing these. There's no licenses to import these, so it's quite tricky to get hold of copies of these trees. But it's also worth noting it's vital to have genetic variety to prevent that disaster happening all over again. So it's all very well saying Adamus is a great promising thing, but if we were to literally just use Adamus on its own and populate the whole English countryside with just Adamus, well, there's no genetic variation. It hasn't got viable seeds. And so literally you just have 100% clones of one species. It just takes Dutch elm disease to mutate slightly, and basically we've got the same problem all over again. There is a website called resistantelms.co.uk. This is the life's work of Dr. David Hurling, who I became friends with. He created one called Ulmus wingham, the Wingham elm, formerly known as FL493 clone. And that is now available finally via Frank P. Matthews Nursery. And this is what we've decided to use in the Wildlife Trust experiment that we're going to talk about in a second. Experimental plantations across the UK that Dr. Hurling coordinated and set up, one of which is in Greno Woods, which I worked with the Wildlife Trust to crowdfund money for, and we planted 3 individuals of 8 different resistant elm species. This is us planting them. There's Dr. Hurling, there's me and the Wildlife Trust representative, and there's the group of us that did the planting on the day in February 2018. And the whole idea is there's different conditions. So we're in a woodland area here in Sheffield. Other areas are on clay soil, other areas are on chalk soil, some are in full sunlight, some are in shade. The idea is to see which varieties grow best in different habitats and climate conditions, so that we have a greater understanding of which of the 8 species of elm grow in the best conditions, or which conditions are best for each elm species. So there is a future, but probably not as a landscape tree. Just a little bit more about this. Here's 2 maps. Here's 2016 in my area of Sheffield, southwest Sheffield. There's Ecclesall Road, there's the Inner Ring Road. There was 4 street trees, 4 resistant elms in 2016. And through the work that I've done with Sheffield Council and Amy, we've now got 58 today in the same precise area, and that's where they all are. So from 4 to 58, it's gone from 0.2% to 2.5% of the area's street trees in just 5 years. And the aim is to reach about 5%, or around 120 years in that area in the next 5 years. And that's part of the overall Sheffield Street Tree project to increase the biodiversity of our street trees. Just generally, we've got too many cherries and too many limes in our area, and that makes it not particularly biodiverse, and not particularly good if a tree disease comes in and affects all the limes and cherries. So having elms at a maximum of 5% is probably a good thing, just generally, but it's also a good thing for the elm. And actually, when this work is complete, hopefully in the next 5 years, we'll have probably one of the greatest concentrations of elms in the whole UK, actually, when this work is complete. So that's pretty amazing stuff, and obviously great news for the white-letter hairstreak butterfly, which has got its colony there now currently, and hopefully they'll spread to all these elms in the next 15, 20, 30 years. And just to say that we've got a mix of trees. We've got Ulmus New Horizon, Ulmus Rabona, Ulmus Commonella, and Ulmus One Oak Varda, and there's a few others as well. So we've really mixed it up as best we can with all these trees to make sure that we're got enough of as much variety as possible. All of them are Dutch Elm Disease resistant species. What lessons can we learn for the future? Well, the devastation caused by Dutch Elm Disease was an early warning about how one of our most common trees could become virtually extinct as a mature tree in just 25 years. But we didn't learn that lesson, did we? Ash dieback reached the UK in 2012. We had Phytophthora ramorum arrived in 2009, killing Japanese larch, which was a key timber tree. If you go to Wales and Scotland, you see whole hillsides just ripped out, all their larches, and just it's quite shocking to see. Horse chestnut leaf miner arrived naturally. Horse chestnut bleeding canker possibly less naturally. Both diseases or pests working together to significantly weaken and ultimately kill horse chestnuts. Hopefully it's less of a disaster than first thought, and some horse chestnuts will survive, but it's not good. Not good. It's another tree. From our childhood, most people remember the conkers from the local horse chestnut tree, and actually we're going to have less of them because of these 2 pests, less of them being planted in the future. And so in 2, 3, 4, 5 generations time, there'll be less horse chestnuts. Acute oak decline and sudden oak death are creating problems for oaks. Phytophthora ostracidri has been killing native juniper since 2011, and the biosecurity remains very lax and is unlikely to change. More diseases and pests are on their way. We've got sweet chestnut gall wasp and chestnut blight, emerald ash borer coming from the east, from Moscow area into Eastern Europe, and eventually probably to the UK. That will finish off ash if ash dieback doesn't. We've got the threat of elm yellows, maybe not zigzag elm sawfly, but potentially elm yellows, which is a problem in Southern Europe for Southern Europe's elms as well as Dutch elm disease. Plane tree wilt, and then xylella, which is probably the most feared of all the likely to impact tree diseases. It's affecting many plant species in Europe, but particularly olive trees, and it's said that oak trees are also susceptible. And I was just seeing on Twitter yesterday that in Ireland they'd imported some firewood. Guess where from? From Italy, where they've been felling the olive trees because they were infected with xylella, and some of the people have been illegally importing the firewood from xylella affected areas and importing it to Ireland. So fingers crossed they caught it before it's infected any local species in Ireland, but just shows what a problem it could be. And I'm pretty much guaranteed that xylella will will enter the UK at some point. It's just how long can we keep it out for? So there's some lessons for the future, a bit wider than the topic of elms and Dutch elm disease and white-letter hairstreaks. Here we go onto the white-letter hairstreak. It uses, I think I've said before, it uses elms exclusively as a larval host plant, generally in the high canopy of tall elms. So it can be overlooked, difficult to see, but they do come down for nectar sometimes. You can identify it if it does come down by this characteristic W shape on its wing. Hence it's got the name white-letter hairstreak. Flight period is of late June to late July in the UK, but it has declined significantly as elms have declined. If you want to see one, it is hard to see, as I said, but if you're in Sheffield, anywhere near the Chelsea Road elm tree, if you go to and stand sort of underneath the canopy of the Chelsea Road elm tree in the first week of July on a sunny day, particularly in the morning each year, and you stand there for long enough, probably 20 minutes, you will see a flutter in the canopy, and that is a white-letter hairstreak flying in the canopy of the tree. I've seen it every year since I've been watching in 2016, and the colony still survives now. But you need to know where you're going. You need to find a big mature elm tree, preferably. There's not many of those, and then you need to crane your neck and look up for a period of time before you see one, and you have to go on the right day at the right time of year. So they are tricky to see, but they do come down. And this picture was taken by me, funnily enough, in Europe, actually, not in the UK, but I did get very close to this. And if they do come down and they are nectaring, they're pretty docile, and you can get pretty close, as I did, and you can take a photograph, but you have to be in the right place at the right time. Other elm-dependent species, the elms are host to 80 species of invertebrate, actually. The white-letter hairstreak is just the most famous, but there's 80 species of invertebrate uses elm trees. The leaves are eaten by the peppered moth, the light emerald moth, the white spotted pinion moth, amongst others. Elm flowers in February and March. If you know what you're looking for, you can identify a tree from a mile away just by knowing what a tree looks like in February and March and the way the flowers come out. But they provide lots of early nectar for many insects. Obviously with the loss of elms, which had an unusual early nectar, maybe that's partly contributed to some of the insect decline we've got. Many birds and some mammals eat the elm seeds too, when the elm seeds are out in usually about April, May time. The elms are also host to 2 unique species of lichen, as well as many other lichens, which are elm specialists. So yeah, with the elms going, so have the lichens. And whilst not a direct causal link, the decline of elms did contribute to the extinction of the large tortoiseshell butterfly in the UK. Funnily enough, the large tortoiseshell does seem to be making a comeback now, because it seems to have adapted to other species as well, but tree species as well. But it is interesting that large tortoiseshell pretty much went extinct in the UK at the same time as elms disappeared. Probably wasn't the only factor, but it was a contributing factor. Finally, we're onto the initiative itself. What are Sheffield Rotherham Wildlife Trust doing, working with me from Nether and Sharrow Sustainable Transformation? Well, the aim is to protect the existing small colonies of white-letter hairstreaks and other less visible elm-dependent species too, and to provide habitat for them to expand into. No garden centres that I'm aware of sell elms, and very few tree nurseries do either. I think this is probably because elms are unfamiliar to many people below a certain age, and they're also perceived to be vulnerable to disease because of what happened with Dutch Elm Disease. Even if the modern cultivars are 100% resistant, most people don't know that. So NESST and the Wildlife Trust are teaming up to encourage Sheffield and Rotherham citizens to plant elms on their land and in their gardens. The cultivar we've chosen is the Wingham elm, which was previously known, as I said, as FL493. We're selling them for just over £20 each, and they're grown in 3-litre pots. They're about 2.5 meters tall, so just be aware of that if you are considering buying one. They're quite big already. You can purchase one for yourself via the Wildlife Trust website, or instead pay for one to be planted on public land in Sheffield. If you've not got space yourself, you can in effect donate and pay for one to be grown elsewhere. And in roughly 5 to 10 years' time, the trees should begin to flower. And in 10 to 20 years' time, they'll become large enough to host the white-letter hairstreak butterfly. Obviously, the butterfly will need to then find a tree because it needs to disperse from existing colonies. But there is a bit of a myth about butterflies not traveling very far. They absolutely do. And they particularly do in hot summers. The summer of 1976, the summer of 2013, summer of 2018, and there's this summer as well. Butterfly colonies of all species did disperse very well and expanded. And so this is what you need, and it happens periodically. So yes, it might not happen next year, it might not happen the year after that, it might not happen for 5 years, but there'll be a dispersal year, and eventually your white-letter hairstreak will find one of the big elms that you might have planted this year, but they'll find it in 10 to 20 years' time, and that's the start of making the white-letter hairstreak a common butterfly again. But it will happen. Plant it and they will come, as we all say. That just as a bit of an example, here's the Wingham elms. You see the size of the tree compared to the person. This is as though being loaded on the pallet before being delivered to Sheffield. So you can see how big they are and also the size of the leaves. And there's an example in Italy of a Wingham elm that's about 10 to 20 years old. I don't know precisely, but I'm going to say 10 to 20 years old, probably about 15 years old. That's how big they've got after 15 years. So you've got a bit of an idea. And there we go. I think that's me done in terms of the presentation. And so over to questions if people have got them.
I noticed there was one question about translocation. I can answer that because that's my specialism in white-letter hairstreaks. Back in the 90s, I did a major project on white-letter hairstreak, as well as now being the Wildlife Trust butterfly specialist. That was where I got into white-letter hairstreaks in particular. And I did try lots of experiments with translocating white-letter hairstreaks. So it has been done, but it hasn't been done widely. There isn't much expertise in it. It's been done with other species, but not particularly with white-letter hairstreak. So I do know the methods to it. And when the Chelsea Road elm was threatened in 2016, there was a very diseased limb, and that diseased limb had to be removed by the council. So we spent, along with Paul and residents of Nether and members of Sheffield Rotherham Wildlife Trust, turned up on a very, very cold February day, just before the beast from the east came. And we, as Amy removed the limb, we searched every single twig of that removed limb from the Chelsea Road elm for white-letter hairstreak eggs. And we found some, not many, 2 or 3, I think, and they were translocated. And the twigs were cut into small sections, and they were tied to the twigs of one of the disease-resistant elms in the nearby Chelsea Park. So it can be done, but obviously, as I've just described, it's a very complicated, time-consuming procedure, and obviously we can't do that with all the dying elms. It has become a serious problem. In the last 5 years, I mean, Paul's talked mostly about elms that we've lost around Nether Edge. I live in the centre of Sheffield, and there are lots of elms, or there were lots of wych elms in Norfolk Park and in Keywood. In the last 5 years, we've lost probably 50% of those elms in just 3 to 5 years. That's how serious it's become. And it would be impossible to search those trees and remove all the eggs from there, because I know that there are very good-sized colonies of white-letter hairstreak using those trees in Norfolk Park and in Keywood. So those are 2 of the sites that we're working with. We're working with Sheffield City Council on this project. They have agreed for us to plant up to 15 new disease-resistant trees. So if you didn't have a space for a tree yourself, but you wanted to contribute to this project, you could purchase an elm, and one of the places we could plant it would be in Norfolk Park, where Sheffield City Council have given us permission to plant at least 15 trees to replace the trees that have succumbed in there, where we already know there are populations of white-letter hairstreak. But there are also plenty of elms on our nature reserves, and some of those nature reserves will also be looked at for suitability, and we will, if you choose that method and decide to purchase a tree, for us to plant. Some of them will also go on our nature reserves.
Thanks, Ben. Shall I cover some of the questions in the sidebar? So there's a first question there from Janet Williams. She was told that the new elm on Albany Road had an American elm ancestry. Is that right? There's actually quite a few new elms on Albany Road. I'm pretty sure, I need to check, but I'm pretty sure all of them are almost Rabona, and that has definitely got American elm ancestry. Definitely, yes, it has. What exactly is a cordon sanitaire, says John Scully? Well, it's a French phrase, but basically in practical terms, what does it mean? In Brighton, they were very lucky to have the South Downs as a bit of a natural no tree sort of gap. But the elm bark beetle did occasionally get through. And what they did is, as soon they basically got everybody, did a publicity campaign, they got everybody they possibly could to be aware of what Dutch elm disease looked like. And as soon as it was spotted, there was an emergency line that people called. The tree fellers went in and either felled the whole tree and burnt the wood, or felled sufficient branches low enough down that they caught it quick enough and burnt those branches. And basically, it was basically eliminated it as best they could. It's sort of, I suppose you could say, it was a bit like the early stages of COVID. They tried to isolate and eliminate as best they could any hint of disease, and it worked very successfully for a very long period. But as I said, the log burners situation is making it a bit difficult these days. There's a question there about, are any of my elms in Endcliffe Park? I'm not aware of any resistant elms at the moment at all in Endcliffe Park at the moment. There should be, hopefully there will be at some point soon. There's not any at the moment that I've ever seen. We've got another question. Oh, that's the translocation question from Caroline Weston. Then we've got John Scully asking, how big will these trees grow? If you plant one in your garden, aren't you creating potential problems for the next generations? Well, it depends what you class as a problem, really. So yes, these trees will grow very big. Yeah, elms are known to grow quite tall, potentially 40 meters tall in the end at maximum growth after 100 years. So they can grow very big, but it depends on the size of your garden, and it depends on what people like. I've got big trees at the back of my garden. My garden only goes back 15 meters, but they're not causing any problems whatsoever. So it depends what the situation is, really, John. It doesn't really matter. What individuals think, what I believe, what you believe. It depends on the individual who's purchasing the tree, well, what they find is suitable for their garden. And it doesn't have to be garden, does it? It can be wider land.
And to answer Jonathan's question that has just come in as well, why is it that the disease taken so long to reach Sheffield? Well, it hasn't. It did spread up, as Paul said, back in the 1980s, but because we had wych elm here, which is more resistant to the disease, which is predominant elm species in Sheffield and Rotherham, it didn't succumb as badly as it did in the south, where the population was largely English elm. But in the last, it's also to do, as also Paul mentioned in his presentation, to do with the climate change, because Sheffield is obviously in the north, and so the beetle prefers warmer conditions. It's so when as the climate has got warmer and the temperatures have increased in Sheffield, in the last few years, particularly when we've had very, very hot summers, there seems to have been a correlation with the increase in Dutch elm disease. Because the beetle's population has exploded, and there's been more of an increase in Dutch elm disease. So hot summers, they're fantastic for helping butterflies to spread, but they're also bad because they also mean that the pest species have bumper years as well. That's true, but it's worth saying that it didn't take that long for Dutch elm disease to get to Sheffield. It entered the country in 1964 in the southwest Gloucestershire area, and it was in Sheffield around 1980. It didn't take very long, and then the summer of 1976, the long hot summer of 1976, rapidly affected it. That was when it really was noticed most across the country. It hit Sheffield very shortly afterwards, and so it wiped out most of the mature elm trees in Sheffield in 1980. Then we had a respite because it wiped out virtually every single tree, and the elm bark beetle had nowhere to go.
and then somehow it came back to Sheffield in about 2012, maybe just before, maybe just afterwards. But yeah, and it's what started to wipe out all the newly mature elm trees again, as Ben's noted. I had a question.
And also on that same subject, which is absolutely true. I remember when I was a kid, there was a whole row of elm trees on Herringthorpe Valley Road in Rotherham, lined with English elms. They went all the way down to the town centre. All those elms were felled in the 1980s. It used to be a spectacular elm-lined road, and all those were felled because of Dutch Elm Disease in the 80s. So we did lose a lot of trees around that period.
I had a direct question from Jerry. How is Paul estimating the age of trees? Well, I mean, it's not a precise science. It's just through years and years of knowledge of working with trees, just generally, and you can guesstimate. I can't say I'm precisely right. The only way I'd be precise if I chopped the tree down and measured the rings of the tree, but I'm not going to do that, am I? So I'm just guessing things from doing that.
I asked Paul, I asked because I was a botanist and we were estimating some ages of trees. And then when we actually had the dendrochronology done, we discovered that they are actually 300% older than we thought they were. Yeah, so it's an inexact science. I just wanted to.
Absolutely. It depends on the conditions. I'll give you an example. The lime trees on my road that I know for a fact, because I know when they were planted, they're 120 years old, but because they're in a street condition with tarmac all around the base, they don't grow very quickly.
No.
And so you wouldn't be able to tell for certain just because of that. So it's a very fair point. Nikki asked, are logs for wood burners only a risk if logs are some kind of elm? Well, yes. So the elm bark beetle will only be in elm logs. But what people are doing is going, I don't know, to Hampshire or wider Sussex, chopping down trees in the countryside, whether they be alive or dead, bringing them back to Brighton, storing them outside their houses, and that it has to be elm logs because that's where the elm bark beetles are, and that's where in the spring the elm bark beetle emerges and it kills the trees nearby. Just seeing if there's any other questions. They're just comments, I think. Now I've got to go now because it's 1 o'clock and I've got to get back to work. Is any other final question before we go?
I wanted to ask whether you'd tried the general cemetery as a possibility, because the environment group is considering the planting scheme at the moment.
Yeah, we've just started a conversation about meadows actually with them. And yes, I'd like to extend that to covering buckthorn and elms for both types of butterfly. So that, yes, a very good suggestion. And thanks for the comment about the wallpaper. Great. Thank you for your time, everybody. Hope you have a lovely day. And sorry, I'm having to rush off to get back to work, but hope you take part in the initiative. You've seen all the details in the sidebar, and hopefully you've seen it even when you looking into the talk. You've seen about what we're all doing and how to sign up and purchase an elm. So enjoy the rest of your days and see you soon.
Thank you. If you do have any more questions that haven't been covered in the talk, you can, of course, contact us via the links on the website, or you can contact me directly or anybody involved with the Elm project. So please do that. We hope you all take part. Thank you very much for joining us today.